about you and when you came into the business and how you happened to come into the business, and he gave you a sense of the fact that you had uh, both a parental experience that set you up for this business, as well as the fact that you had worked for many, many years to support yourself and your child. And so I'd like to have you start with yourself, okay? And then I'd like to have you tell me at what point you came into this company. And then we'll talk about John, okay? So just first talk about yourself. Yeah, is it on? Okay.
Is there a
Start at any point. Start at any point.
It's interesting when you say talk about yourself. I hardly ever can talk about myself, I think. I don't like to talk about myself too much, but I hardly ever talk about myself without thinking about my parents. Because I feel a very strong connection.
They were in this business.
My father was the founder of Sandra Post, which was a very innovative concept 50 years ago when he started it.
Tell Donna about it, because I had
it was one of the first specialty stores in America that specialized only in something called sportswear, which then nobody knew what sportswear was. And I think he first started with like beautiful dyed-to-match cashmeres and, gabardine slacks and silk blouses, and those were really the days of when Dalton and people like that, were of the highest price of what was going on, in America. And he was an extraordinary person who I came to realize, when I grew up.
The business was Florida?
The business started in New York. His first store was 89th and Broadway next to Schrapp's. Mm-hmm. And a lot of young people then lived on the west side. That was what maybe the east side is today. That's what the west side was then. And there were a lot of affluent people that lived in that area, that shopped in that area. And that's where he started it. And then he extended it. I think there were one or two stores in Long Island, like in one of the 5 towns. And then he decided that there was a frontier in Florida and moved there very, very early, I think in 1949. So quite early. And opened up his first store, which was on Lincoln Road. It was not a mall then. It was a street. There were cars on the street. And
it was post-World War II.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And
how old were you?
I was 2.
You were a baby.
So I knew nothing but Florida. To me, I was born and bred in Florida. I never saw snow till I was 18. I really didn't know winter, those kind of winters. I was an island kid, and it was different then because we lived there. No one locked doors. Everyone knew everyone. And it was a small town.
Where did you live in Florida?
I lived on Miami Beach. And I lived on an island called Normandy Shores. And my parents' house was on the water. And we were water browns, all of us. I have 2 older sisters. And I think that we had a blessed upbringing in the sense that we had a lot of warmth and we had this very, very beautiful, beautiful, glamorous mother. My mother was 5'8.5" and 18 when she met my father, and she was the top model in New York. And he was 30. And it was this whirlwind love affair. And I got married, and he was this confirmed bachelor running this very glamorous stores and very eligible bachelor, and we got married. And she didn't start working until we were I guess I was in about 2nd grade when she went to work. And she was the selector, although he always had wonderful taste and he was great in spotting, trends and knowing when to get in them and out of them. And So there was always fashion conversation going on in our house, you know. And plus, she was not only worked, but she was very involved in the community down there.
So in the sense that you both were young people who had a generational interest, you know, generation spanning interest in this industry,
No,
which is interesting.
I mean, mine was on the other side of the fence, but it was both fashion. And his father and my father knew each other for years and years and years, and they loved each other, which was very interesting too. And Johnny knew my father 20 years before I knew him. And he and my father really cared about each other a lot. And there was a great friendship there long before I even married him. So that was a very nice sort of byproduct of the whole of John's and my relationship, was the fact that there was this friendship that was there even before we met, but that got stronger and stronger and stronger as we, you know, after we married.
Now you said you became a buyer.
Well, what happened is that I first out of school worked in the stock market, and I became a stock option broker, and I was the coordinator in Miami for Reynolds and Company, which is no longer in business. Their coordinator between Miami and New York for stock options, and that was before the Chicago board even existed. So there was no, you know, there was no, you know, market that was, you know, published like there is today on options and things like that. This was a little bit different. And then I was married to someone else who also was in fashion. And I moved to Dallas, and I lived there for 4.5 years. And I made just great friends there. I mean, people that I'm still very, very close with today, which is how Heather and Dick Marks and I became such close friends. Because Heather was my best friend in Dallas. And we had babies together, and you know, those kind of friendships, those kind of ages and stages in your life are kind of friendships you never make again. Because the funny things that you go through at those points in your lives, I mean, never go through again. And then, you know, the marriage didn't work out, and I moved back to Florida, and I decided that I wanted to do something that had a very stable income, because the stock market was not a stable income, because I had a child and I had to support her and myself, because I really was the type of person that I had no intention of taking money from my parents. And Texas is a community private state. There's no alimony. So there I was out there in the world. And I had made up my mind I wouldn't take any money from my parents. And our community probably consisted of 2 cars. He got one and I got one. And that's about it. And so I decided that I was going to go to work for Bird Eye.
And your child was about 3?
She was 2.
2?
Just 2.
Pretty gutsy.
And I had to get child care for her that I could afford. And that was decent. And I had to put her in, you know, a private school and get her all organized so that I could work. And I started as an assistant buyer there in junior dresses. And actually, the divisional at the time was a young woman by the name of Susan Carey, who's now Lord & Taylor. And Susan was tough. Susan taught me a lot, really a lot. And the buyer, first there was a buyer, and she got promoted, and they brought in this other buyer, because I had only been there 3 months, and I was there long enough to become the buyer. So they brought in this man from Jordan Marsh, and he proceeded to have a nervous breakdown. So I ended up being the only person who knew anything about the department. So they moved me along really quickly, and Mel Jacobs was the president. He was a dear friend of mine.
Still.
In fact, I was supposed to have lunch with him tomorrow, but we have to go to Milliken. So I switched until the following week. But
how is he doing?
Oh, he's doing. I think he's just. I'll know better after lunch, but he's just such a wonderful man. We've maintained this sort of funny kind of relationship where he's just always. He views me as the person. You know, he's watched this growth that I've had, but I always see him as he was, and he always sees me as I was, and so there's this very warm, wonderful feeling between us. Anyway, I said to him at the time, well, why don't you just make me the buyer? And he said, because I made this rule that everybody has to go out to a branch for a year. He said, you don't have to go out for a year, but you have to go out for a few months. He said, so I'm going to make a deal with you. He said, you're going to go out to 163rd Street, which was the second largest branch of Rhode Island. He said, you're going to have all of sportswear and swimwear. He said, the swimwear sale comes up in July. He said, if you beat Dadeland, I will make you a buyer the next day. I said, you have a deal. And we shook hands on it. And I beat Dadeland by $1,000. And he made me a buyer the next day. A young man came out to interview me who was the divisional of children's wear, lingerie, and accessories. And the young man's name was John Burden. And John hired me as his buyer for a little girl 7 to 14. And Mel kept his promise, and the next day I was made a buyer, and John Burden and I became extraordinary friends. Because not only was he my boss, but we traveled all over together, and we built this wonderful business together, and he had a lot of belief in me. And he was never intimidated by the fact that Mr. Jacobs said, I'd like this girl to be made a buyer tomorrow. And he always looked at me, you know, for what I did in the department and everything. And we put on like $200,000 the first year in children's wear, which was amazing because the average sale was next to nothing. And we made lots of money on it too. So they were really happy. And then that next year, June Fitzgerald decided to move to California, and she was buying contemporary, better, and designer sportswear. And they interviewed me for the contemporary part of the job, and I told them that I wouldn't take it unless they gave me the whole job. The contemporary part was as big as the department I was buying, which was the children's wear, and I wasn't a snob about what I was buying. And I felt I did a great job in children's wear, and I loved John Burden, and I really didn't want to leave him. I was very comfortable, and I had a child. I wasn't looking for that more traveling unless something terrific came with it, like these great departments. And so I told him I wouldn't take the job. So John Burden said to me, how can you not take this job? This is the plum job in the store. You have to take this job. I said, no, I really don't have to take it. I said, it's trading. You know, I don't care if I buy $2 million worth of contemporary sportswear or $2 million worth of children's wear. It doesn't make any difference to me what I buy. If I do well, what's the difference? I make money for the store. So Mr. Jacobs coming back tomorrow. He'll speak to you tomorrow. So Mel came back the next day, and he called me, and he said, please be in my office at 9:30. And I said, okay. And I went up to his office, and he went through the whole story all over again about this plum department and everything. So I understand all that. I went through my feeling all over again. And he said, I'll let you know tomorrow. I said, okay. And they called me the next day, and they said, you have the whole job. He said to me, he couldn't believe that I held out for it, but I really felt that way. I knew I could do the job. Those, you know, two of the departments were not really making money, and I just felt that the contemporary department was like on the crest of the wave. That was timing. June, that was timing. She walked out, and I walked in, and I looked like a genius. But the truth was, it was timing.
No, but the point is, you even understood that it was, and there were a lot of people who were walking away from it. We remember that whole period of the beginning of contemporary and the number of the broken bodies that it left in its wake with the management not understanding what the hell this was all about.
Well, the first year I ran a 200 trend most of the year, which meant I was 200% ahead. And she was a good buyer. I already had good figures. So the first year I really killed the figures. But that was when, I mean, look at what was the contemporary resources. Nick shirts, pants. I mean, when you think what Outlander, which is cute, Outlander sweaters was the contemporary resources then. And all these different resources, which today may or may not be considered. Certainly Tanner is not contemporary, Nick shirts are not contemporary anymore. But it's interesting to see just the change in that. I would sell 400 Nick-Nick, 400 to 500 Nick-Nick shirts a week. A week.
What's happened to Nick-Nick? Where is it?
But that's like, Anyway, so that's how I met John, because when they gave me those areas,
you came to the city.
Well, I used to come to the city for children's wear too, but I had no exposure to anyone in this market, you know, dresses, sportswear, anything like that. I spent all my time with John Burden and with the people in the children's wear market. So that's how I met John. Because I was buying Casper for JL Sport, was in my designer department. Breckenridge was in my better department. Outlander was, we didn't own Outlander then, but anyway. So I had two of the major resources, though, were Leslie Fay Company.
And Johnny was doing what then?
He was president of Leslie Fay.
He was president.
And how I actually met him, well, it's sort of a long story, but I met him through business. But someone had tried to fix him up with me twice, unbeknownst to me. And they kept using my other name, because in business I went under my other name. So he never connected me with my father until,
He was unmarried at that point?
He was separated. He was just getting divorced.
Yeah.
His divorce was almost done. He was separated already 10 months when I met him. And so I had lunch with him the first day I met him. And typical Johnny style, because he had really this confidence and this sense of humor. We went to Giordano's right here for lunch, and we were walking back across to go. I was going back to appointments and whatever. And he looked at me and he said, I'm going to marry you. And I looked at him and said, you're not something, you're crazy. And I just kept walking. I didn't pay any much attention to him. I thought he was really nuts. And I had been dating someone else at the time, and whatever. But he was very persistent and started flying down that next weekend. And from that point on, we started seeing each other.
Now, did you work immediately after you married him? Did you go on working? Or?
What happened is that Mel Jacobs said to me, first of all, I made a promise to him that until he got himself situated, Mel, that I would commute.
Mm-hmm.
So the first few months, I commuted between New York and Florida until Mel was comfortable with how he was going to split it up. And he did split it up to 3 different buyers at that time. And that was when they split it up. So they decided it had already grown at that point, to such a point that they didn't want to give one person that buy. So they split it up with 3 different buyers. And then he said to me, don't quit. He said, take a leave of absence from Federated, and then let me set up some appointments for you with Bloomingdale's, and I still think you should work, and all that. So I did. I let him do that, and along with interviewing with them, I interviewed with other stores in the city, Saks and Baumwitz, and I can't remember all the stores, but it was almost everybody. And Bloomingdale's offered me a job. Several stores offered me a job, but Bloomingdale's offered me a job, and it was all the knitwear, and their biggest resource was Outlander, which we didn't own then. And what happened was, the day before I was to start, Leslie Fay bought Outlander. And I was really uncomfortable.
You were already married.
We were already married. And there was some discussion about it being a conflict of interest.
His dad was still a very dominant part of the business.
Yeah. And so I decided not to take the job. And they offered me other departments, but they weren't things that I really liked to buy. So I decided not to do it. And then what I did was a freelance thing with young artists, sort of young designers and artists, where I would it started out because Neiman Marcus, through Richard, said to me, we're always looking for new young people that aren't well distributed, that aren't marketed all over the place. He said, why don't you work for us? Why are we laughing?
We'll tell you.
Okay. He said, why don't you work for us and find us these people, and we will pay you a fee on what we do with those resources. So then I decided, well, if I'm going to do this for them, I might as well do it for other people too.
As a business.
And then if the store is paying me, then I won't take the money from the resource.
Right.
If the store isn't paying me and I market it for the resource, then the resource can pay me a commission.
Right.
And that's how it worked. And that worked just. And I also did. I designed a fragrance candle for Estee Lauder and a bottle top. And I ended up producing the fragrance candle for them. It was a special edition for a promotion they were doing for Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus. And it was 2 sizes, and it was an iris. And I designed it, and then I had it made in Long Island City. And they ended up buying 10,000 of them. It was very interesting experience. And I really
So
learned.
you were into product development, and you were
Yeah.
an entrepreneur now.
And then what happened is a lot of these artists were crazy. Like, they really needed handholding and babysitting and everything, which I didn't
Like
mind at all.
agency, it's
Yeah.
agency.
And I didn't mind it. I really, because I found them all interesting, and they had all these personal problems, and half of them were on drugs, and But I was started getting these calls at 2:00 in the morning, and John he said, "This has got to stop. This is not good." So, what happened was that an old timer. I don't know if you knew this man, but his name was Irwin Guild.
No. Name of the
Irwin Guild ran the original Andrea Gale. When Andrea Gale was the resource that did the pantsuits and the knitted, he wanted to update this place, and he came to me and said, "Would you help us in product development?" And so I came, and I didn't want to work in our company, but I said, "Oh, all right," and I came, and we worked together, and it was okay. I didn't love what I was doing, but it was okay because I couldn't totally relate to the product, the fabrics and the price range and everything. And then Irwin decided to retire, and John brought in another man who I really did not respect. And and he was intimidated by my position in the company. And I said, "John, listen, if he's not happy with me, he can fire me. It's okay." I said, "Because you have hired this man, so you believe in him, and I'm going to back you up no matter what. So if he's not comfortable, then you should let me go." So I worked with him for about a month, and it was really not good because we were not a good chemistry together. And he said he didn't think that we could work together. I said, "Fine." So I set a date that I was going to leave. Now the line started to look really beautiful, and then I'm ready to leave. And the guy says, "Can you stay?" I said, "No, I can't stay. I really can't." I said, "Because first of all, I really don't think this is a good team. People have to have a chemistry." I said, "I really don't." And I really felt in my heart that he wasn't going to make it at Leslie Fay. And he was with us a year, and he didn't make it. I just knew he wasn't going to make it in our organization. It just wasn't going to happen. And at that point, which was a distressing time for me, I must say, it was really a distressing time. And that was a point where it was a difficult point for John and me in that I had to separate being John's wife and working for this company and supporting John because he made a decision, and I was his wife.
What year was that?
That was about 1977 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
So I stopped working for the company. At that point, Alan Gallo came to me, and he had a problem. It was our biggest company. It was right before fall season. He was president of Personal Sportswear.
Yeah.
And it wasn't our biggest company then. Leslie Fay Dress was still bigger than it is now. Personal's now bigger, which we don't release figures by division. So
Who was
most
the woman
people don't.
who was the
Here
the referee?
was Gloria Gelfand.
Gloria.
But the
Was she
original
during
was
that period?
Alan and Edie Gladstone.
I didn't realize Edie was part of that.
Edie's back here.
She is?
I just hired her back.
How
And
marvelous.
she did the most wonderful fall one line, and this fall two line is fantastic.
How marvelous. Did you work with
I loved it.
Gelfand?
No,
You didn't.
no.
I can't see the two of you together.
I mean, we're nothing like. I bought from Gloria when she was running Picado. That was one of my resources in Better Sportswear for her.
She's brilliant.
I think she's brilliant. I think she's a very good marketer.
Brilliant marketer. Brilliant marketer.
That's her strongest strength. I think that when Gloria gets into the other things is when she gets into trouble. If she would just stay in what she does best, I think she would be happier in a sense. But,
Let's get back to color.
Anyway, so Alan came to me and he said, "Look, I have this big fall line to do. I just fired my design director." He said, "Will you come and do the product?" I said, "Listen, I don't want to work for the company. This is not a good idea. I don't like this idea." I said, "It didn't work over in Dresden." He said, "It worked with Irwin. It was great. It was fine." He said, I think you ought to, do it. And I said, look, I mean, and he was my best friend too, so it's hard to say no to someone that's your best friend that says to you, I need your help, I'm in trouble. And yet I didn't want to work for the company. So I said, look, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll do this for you on a freelance. I'm not on the company's book. I get paid to my little corporation. I don't have anything to do with the company. I said, okay. And we set a fee for the season, and I did the line for fall. The line was stupendous. It was wonderful. So now he said, well, will you do holiday? It's all right. So I did holiday. And he said, well, will you do spring? So I did spring. And then after I did spring, he came to me and says, this is stupid. Now I have to go on the books. So I did. And of course, I wasn't even in the same building as the corporate offices, because Alan and I were over here at Personal. And it was the most wonderful business marriage. It really was. I mean, we just respected each other. We had great meetings of the minds. We understood each other on the same wavelength. And I worked there for 9.5 years. And when I came there, we were doing $45 million. And last year, we did 160. So it was a very rewarding experience, because to watch that thing grow and to know that, my key areas were the store relations and the product. And Alan was the manufacturing, the operations, and the overseeing. It was perfect.
Key combination.
It was just perfect. We were very good together. And then Johnny came and said, look, we've got this big problem with Breckenridge. I want you to move to Breckenridge and run Breckenridge. I said, no, I don't want to do this, because I don't want any bottom line responsibility. It's not my forte. It's not what I do best, So it took them about 7 months, but they convinced me to come over here, and that was 2 years ago. And we have, in fact, really turned it around.
You turned it around?
And the thing that we have to do now this year is that we've turned the company around in the sense that when I walked in here, there were 2 major stores left on the book. Now we have the top 150 back on the book. The product is terrific. I think the whole feeling of the place is really good and positive, and I've got a good team. The president, who's essentially in charge of the sales end of it, the operations man, the executive vice president, is terrific, and Edie for the product now. So I think that it's a good triumvirate of a team.
How do you see yourself in the business now? What role do you see yourself playing in the business now, from a holistic point of view, the Leslie Fay companies?
Well, I think that probably what's happened is that my best asset to the company is in product and in store relations. And being able to sit down with top management of a company and keying into, 3 to 5 of the sportswear companies and laying out plans by season, by year, unit plans, and being able to solidify that plan, implement it, and then keep
But you're
going.
moving now beyond being part of just Breckenridge, aren't you? In the restructuring of the company.
I'm a corporate director. I'm a
I
senior.
was going to say, so you're part of now what is developing a corporate culture and a mission,
Exactly.
and I sense that. So, in the restructuring.
In the restructuring, I'm going to be overseeing 3 sportswear companies. Originally, I'm a vice president of the company, the corporate company, and I was chairman of Breckenridge. I'm retaining the title here just because they want me to, but I'm becoming a senior vice president of Leslie Fay
Companies.
and to supervise the sportswear companies with Alan. That has been our baby,
Now,
the sportswear company.
Alan's position is
Alan is president of Leslie Fay Companies,
companies.
specifically concentrating on the sportswear segment of the Leslie
see.
Fay Companies business.
And who does the concentration on the dresses?
John.
John.
That's how they break it up.
All right.
So John
So now I
handles the
understand.
dresses, and
Now I
Alan handles sportswear.
All right. Let's talk about.
And I've
John
always
now.
handled sportswear
Let's
with,
talk about John.
with Alan.
Talk to me about John in terms of how you see him and I don't expect you to be objective. This is ridiculous. I want a subjective reading of how you see him as part of your life, personally and professionally. And you said I was articulate about him, but I'm an outsider. I want your reading of the man.
Well, I think very much so the way that Steve and I made half an hour ago is that John is a person who thinks very much with his heart, not just with his head. And I think that John is very much ruled by his heart, by how he feels himself about something and also how he feels the other person is going to feel.
Is that characteristic, which we know is stereotypical of the fashion business, and was part of what, well, it was. The early pioneers, everyone defined them as working more on gut and instinct than on logic and reason. These were pioneers who operated without the educational background. They just did things. So but we're now into a time where words like strategy and planning and interfacing with
Well, when
Wall
I say
Street,
that, I don't
Right.
mean that I mean that as the personal side of John.
all right,
Okay, that he's very much ruled by his heart. In Leslie Fay, I think the most pointed thing is how different John runs this company than his father did. And his father shot from the hip, no planning, no real strategy. What was going on in the moment, that's what he did. And that isn't John. John always wanted to build things with a foundation. Even if it built more slowly, he wanted a foundation, and so there was some real solidity on which the company would be built and how it would grow and expand. He is a strategizer. He is a planner. I think he definitely used his education and the associations from that education to help him strategize. I think also that John, part of his greatest strength is the fact that he will talk to anyone. I mean, like anyone who makes an appointment with him, anyone who, even if it's a waste of time, because he really feels that, you never know when somebody's going to come out of one of those conversations. It's something important, something interesting, an idea. He's not
open.
Very
He's
open.
an open person.
He's not afraid to react on an idea. He can be impulsive about trying to implement something that's new or different. Listen, there is no question that when we bought Head, we didn't know anything about the activity sportswear business. There's a difference between active sportswear and activity sports. We didn't know anything. What do we know about ski wear? And what did we know about the worldwide ski wear? I mean, the German company and just to watch how he attacked it.
Well, talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, to learn about it, because after all, he doesn't speak German, and there's German side to this company, and there was the American side. The American side, he chose what he thought was one of our strongest division heads, who had made a presentation to him, who wanted to run Head, who was very business school oriented and had a plan of how to attack the American Head, who was Andy Gross. And Andy had been, who was his nephew, and Andy had been trained in Leslie Fay dresses and in had been running personal petites, and did a wonderful job. And what I think Andy learned,
This is his nephew.
Andy learned a lot at business school, and Andy learned a lot in his training at Leslie Fay interpersonal. But what he couldn't learn in school, that I think he learned a lot from John and observing John, was that how important people were and how you handle people. And then to really understand these two companies, Johnny had to get into their figures, to get into their marketing, to get into their product, and then to evaluate if we had the right people in the right places. So again, what it was really his tremendous sense of evaluating people skills and timing. And the timing was incredible for it.
Timing.
In Europe, we're probably the biggest skiwear resource. It's funny, and AMF couldn't get that thing off the ground because they weren't an apparel company. You have to have a feeling about product in the apparel business.
I'm, aside from what we're doing right now, I'm curious about is why you haven't pyramided that understanding of the critical value of that division to your whole company. But you haven't done spin-offs of that concept and that marketing direction.
Well, in a sense, there's some of it that's been done. Well, first of all, we like the footwear and things like that. We don't own it.
Are you licensing anything out of it?
Sunglasses. We're a license.
And children. You're a license. You're a license.
We're a license. It's a different kind of a license. We own the license. It's a little different than.
Do you own the license to American rights for Head?
We own all the apparel license for the world. We have the worldwide license for Head.
I see.
So all the apparel that you see in Europe, it's all apparel. It's not the footwear.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the skis. It's not the equipment. Any of the equipment.
But you also do children's.
So that's a license.
That's a license too.
That's our license that we sublicense.
That you sublicense.
Which I'm not sure has done very well.
I just think that this.
I don't think they've done very well.
I just think that this is an incredible arena for growth, and I just wondered whether you've done much thinking about that, because I don't.
Believe me, we've done a lot.
Yeah.
But some of it was we were able to. We did the bathing suits. They were not wonderful. But again, it's product. See, when you do it, you have to have exactly the right product.
Exactly.
We have the right product in tennis wear. We have the right product in golf wear. We have the right product in ski wear. We did not have the right product in swimwear.
Not difficult to correct. Anyway, that's something else. Let's talk about that.
Anyway, so that was an interesting experience for me to watch him in this environment where this was not something he was familiar with. It wasn't dresses and it wasn't sportswear. It was a totally different animal. Plus, it was companies that had different seasonal kind of marketing problems. Shippings maybe only once a year. In the ski wear, once a year shipping. So, it was a totally different business. And to watch him, get into it and analyze it, both from the figures, from the product, and from the resource of the people, was very interesting. And the results of his decisions, are apparent by the growth we've had with the license, which has been tremendous.
How does your lives cross on a personal basis with the people that you feel most strongly about and that he feels most strongly about? Is there a unity of mind about the people who are your mentors and his? Or your influence in his?
I think so.
Who are they?
I think we respect the same people. I know that we both have an enormous amount of respect for Bill Dillard Jr. We love him and we respect him. And Bill is a very bright, no-nonsense, strategically oriented, cut right through everything, get to the point of it, very focused kind of a guy. Where John is a more conceptual, ideas, some of them get solidified, some of them don't, but Bill is very directed. So and like a person like that, we both respect. Maybe, maybe we bring some impulsiveness to someone's life, like Bill, and he brings some real focus, in a sense, to some of the things that we discuss with him, business things. But certainly, like a person like that is someone we both respect. I think he's inspiring because he's so bright, and he's a friend. He's really, really a friend. I think John and I both feel very strongly about Ed Finkelstein. And I think Ed's a very controversial person for a lot of manufacturers because of the position they've taken. And certainly private label is something that eats into our business, there's no question.
I asked John about your relationship in terms of private label, whether you're going to expand that. I don't know how you cannot. You've got to have a division for it. You've got to have a division for it.
You have no choice. You really don't. But, I take someone like Ed, and I think that he's been basically a very supportive customer. And I think even with the private label and things that they've done, they've tried to keep a branded label like Leslie Fay in their stores, not only because the product is right or whatever, but because of his relationship. And I do feel he's a loyal person, and I do respect him an awful lot. I think what he's done is phenomenal. I understand that it's controversial, but he's in a position where he has to do what's right for his company too, when you're head of a big corporation like that. But I don't think that he's the type of person that ever sat down and said, I'm going to cut out my resources. I think that it happened in the process of what they were trying to achieve. On the other hand, I think there's a correction going on right now.
Well, there's going to be, because the pendulum swings in our business. You know that.
John says a very interesting something about our business, and I always remember it, and I always think he's right. And private label is something that is so indicative of this expression. He says that the apparel and related fields of our business, that we're a bunch of ostriches selling sheep. And he says that we stick our heads in the sand about the problems and about the changes, and if one does something, they all do the same thing. And I think he's right.
I'll give you another one that you can hold on to, another phrase, which I think is part of what I mean when I say the pendulum swings, and that's the good part of having been around long enough to see it swing around a couple of times. Friend is not destiny.
That's fabulous. That's great.
Trend is not destiny.
And that's for sure. No truer words were ever spoken. The other thing we're sitting here saying, talking about expressions, and I think the most incredibly wonderful part of John is his wit, is his sense of humor.
Now that has not come through for me, so I don't know him yet.
You don't know him yet.
I really don't know him yet.
He has the most incredible.
Because it doesn't come through down at the college, and we haven't had enough of a one-to-one relationship, so that I haven't caught it yet, and that's good to know.
You've only met him in meetings where he's nervous and uptight, because
very uptight.
When he has to talk about himself is when he gets least funny. But I'll give you. I wish I could get a clip of this, but years ago he was given, when he was president of Joan Leslie. I wasn't married to him then, and I didn't even know him then, but people told me this story, that he was given an award from the Shipping Association of 7th Avenue, the shippers. And he goes to the dinner, and a lot of those people, he really didn't have very much in common with. He grew up totally different.
And a lot of them are, as you say.
And so, it was almost funny for him to receive a shipper's award.
Listen, his father didn't kill him, so his father didn't use the gun.
So he gets up to make his acceptance speech, and he says, "Only can a kid from the streets of Lawrence and Palm Beach get an award like this." And that's John. He can, in the most serious times, or the times when you think, what am I going to say? He will come up with the funniest fades
All right. Tell me quickly high points for you
in our
and
lives.
him. Yes, and him.
Well, certainly, you know, when we were married, you know, that was a high point in our lives. When Leslie Faye did the first buyout, that was a high point.
His
When-
father was still here.
And when Leslie Faye did the second buyout.
Tell me about the second buyout.
Well, the second buyout for me was even more exciting and a higher point than the
Why?
first buyout. Because it was John who made that happen. And his father had said after the first buyout, you guys are going to go bust within 6 months. And that was a gulp for Johnny. And I think one of the reasons John's father wanted to get out was he wanted to get out because he was getting older and wanted his money out, which was fair. And he wanted to get out because he really didn't have enough confidence in John and Ellen. And I really believe and that was a blow for John.
So that was a critical passage.
But that was
time.
a critical time because the reason we had to do the second buyout was because we ate up the tax loss of the first buyout too fast. We were supposed to eat it up in 5 years, and we ate it up in 1.5 years because our business was so good. And that bankrupt company made $1.06 on their money. A totally bankrupt company, which is unheard of. And the first deal was done at whatever it was. I think it was $53 million was the first deal. The second deal was $150 million or $170 million.
Now, who was he getting his counsel from in Wall Street?
Well, first of all, Ira Heckler, who was
Yeah.
in our first deal and in the second deal, was definitely, you know, a very strong factor in getting John to understand the whole concept. Because this was a very sophisticated financial concept.
Right.
No one had ever done that before.
Right.
So, and it was gutsy of John to do that. To take on that much debt, he had to believe in himself and believe in the company.
So Ira
And-
is somebody who is important to talk to.
Oh, I would think so.
Make a note of that. No.
Well, and I think Ira Heckler, I think Harold Janine, who was in the first deal,
Those two people.
said that it was the first, that this Leslie Faye was
I'd like to talk to Janine and to Heckler. This would be Ira
Janine,
Heckler.
Geneen. Harold Janine was,
Harold Janine.
he used to be the head of
IT.
IT&T.
IT.
One of the big
I mean, you
companies.
know, it's just like saying, it's like the story of, you know, which president. When you say Janine, none of your time, but I'm telling you that it's a little like saying I have Heckler.
And then the principal underwriters were Merrill Lynch, who you could speak to, Barry Friedberg at Merrill Lynch, and Mickey Tarnopol at Bear Stearns would be very important to speak to because he's also a board member, and so he's seen Johnny
All right.
in a lot of different roles.
All right. So
And Mickey would be
that'd be interesting.
important to
Okay.
talk to. Tarnopol, Tarnopol. He's at Bear Stearns. I could probably give
Would
you
you
all
do
their
me the
phone
good
numbers.
favor of not only giving me the numbers, but will you set the stage for my call so that they don't think I'm a loony calling?
Okay.
Okay?
So let me get back to the high. So that certainly when we were married, and certainly that first Leslie Faye deal, and certainly the second one.
5.3.
Well, there were personal things in our
Well,
lives that were
Tell
high
me.
points.
Tell me.
You know, I think the night of Albert Einstein was an incredibly important
All right.
night in our lives.
Why?
Because he was really moved by it. And 3 weeks before that dinner was to be staged, Estelle, 300 tickets had been sold. And, you know, John there is no such thing as failure in John's life. I mean, that word is not in his vocabulary, it's not in the dictionary. You know, he doesn't want to even hear about something not being successful.
Is that hard on the children?
I think it is. I think that they feel, you know, pressured to follow in the footsteps of a very, very
Yes, I asked him
successful.
why the girls aren't part of the business with you here, and with women now having the fire in the belly, and with women making it as publishers in the magazine business, women had their first entry in this industry. Why his daughters haven't come yet?
They've all worked, other than the little one, they've all worked in our, even the little one has worked in our showrooms or, spent summers.
They're not ready.
They don't want to go into this business. First of all, they also see us working
Very
hard, long hours. They see the pressures, and I think it's frightening. I really do. And I also think they're different people than we were. Very different people. I think their motivations are different.
They were raised differently.
They were raised differently.
Go back to the high point.
That Albert Einstein was a very important night, without a doubt. I think Marnie's bat mitzvah was a important day in my life. It was a very emotional day. My dad was already starting to get sick, and we knew sort of what was going on, and we were just so proud of her, and there was a whole mixture of emotions going on that day, I think, too. Marnie, Marnie being, of all our children, probably they'd had the most difficult relationship. And he was so proud of her that day. I think that the emotions were just running wild for everybody. I mean, obviously, she's my natural child. I mean, it was a glorious day for me, but it was for him too. And I think he was just so overcome with the pride of her and the whole thing. Our children, how they feel about each other, all three of them. And I think definitely that was.
What kind of father is he?
John loves his children with a passion. He is a spoiling father, without a doubt. He doesn't. He's a good father in that he's the most caring father, as caring about them, But I think he finds it difficult to speak to them about certain issues.
He's more comfortable with men, isn't he?
Well, he certainly isn't comfortable with them
about talking.
But I think you're right. I think he is more comfortable with men.
I know it because I have a nephew.
Yeah.
And we laughed on it the other day with my sister, and we were talking about Mark, who is John's age group. Actually, as a matter of fact, they're equal, and he's also in this industry, and he's also taken his father's business to another plateau. And we were talking about the fact that when Mark grew up, and the point was made that he's not as sensitive to his wife as she, and that a lot of what he does is he emulates his father.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the fact that when Mark was very young, and we remember hearing this in our ears, the men used to play this game with this little kid, hang the women. Hang the women. Hang the women. And it was a big joke, but it was, it was this banter of the guys playing macho and teaching the little kid, and that's, there's a lot of that.
He is soft with them, but he's demanding. And he has expectations. And they feel those expectations, even if he doesn't verbalize them. They feel them. And they all three of them, have a tremendous need to make him happy and to make him proud of them. And to, it's really...
That's very good. That's very good.
They want his recognition.
Mm-hmm.
They want his approval. I think it's approval more than anything else. They desperately want his approval. All three of them. And, the little one is more cavalier about it. But I think basically she really, it's just so important to her, too. The big one, interestingly enough, she's the only one who will end up graduating from University of Pennsylvania like you. So there was a bond there between the two of them with that.
Mhm.
And he was very proud of like her graduation date and everything. I know that was a very proud moment for him.
Laura, I'd like to conclude. Let me see how we're doing here. But I'd like to conclude on something which I think is terribly important.
One of the things I have to be birthday because he took a lot of pride in it.
Your birthday party. Yeah. Well, say it.
No, he just took enormous.
He planned it. He did it all.
He didn't plan it, but he conceived the idea. He said, "I can't plan it. I don't know how to do it. You got to plan it."
Uh-huh.
He said, "But this is what I want to do."
Mm-hmm.
He said, and then you do the rest because I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was his idea, and he wanted to do it, and he relished in every moment of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was such enormous love that came from both of us to each other and for our friends and for our family in that experience, that it had to be, the most incredible time of our lives.
Well, it came through as such. What's different about the fashion industry now and when you first came upon it?
I think that there's a human element that has gone out the window. And by that, I mean, before there used to be so much more effort and time that went into planning a season with a buyer and a merchandise manager and whatever. And it was person to person. It wasn't just a numbers and units plan. It was a product and people plan. And now it's units and numbers.
How terrible.
And I think that that's part of what is different for me, is that the stores are so consumed with the sales plan that they have to achieve. That's all it is in some of these buyers' minds. It's dollars. Some of them don't even.
All right. Well, let's bring it right down to education, because what are we educating for then? What can the college be doing to educate the human resources that this industry needs, if this is the way the industry is operating?
Because I think that
what can we teach these young people?
I think that there has to be integrated studies in life. That yes, the technical aspect of our industry has become very, very important. There's no question about it, and it's increased the efficiency and whatever else, the time factors, the deliveries, and
financing,
whatever, and the financing and all of that. But
watch it, honey.
It's taken away. What the college can do is that I believe that as a whole person, you have to have aspects to you. You have to have artistic aspect. You have to have maybe a philosophical aspect. You have to have a humanity aspect.
Did you go to college?
Yes, I did.
Where did you go?
I graduated from Miami-Dade Community College. Mm-hmm. So that I feel that you have to have aspects to you. And I think what's happening is the kids are coming out and they know how to plan and they know how to, do all the technological aspects, but they've lost sight of some of the more creative and artistic aspects.
Well, also there's the big missing piece is for an industry that is so dependent on social change and cultural developments. There's a complete cultural vacuum in many areas.
It's the cultural part of it.
Cultural area. We know this
missing.
Because you asked why we were laughing before. We do a lot of work with major stores, and for over what was it, 12, 13 years, the Carter Holy Hale stores, and their people would come into New York, and I would give them a list of things that they should be doing and seeing, and taking them out of. I said, you know where the bathroom is in 1407 Broadway now. Listen, take a half a day. You know, you've got to go here. You've got to see this. You can't. You go to Hong Kong, but you don't see anything. You go to Paris, you see nothing. And
That's true.
And we began to identify what was really the missing piece. The very moment when the whole creative liftoff to this business was occurring was the only thing that made the difference. The people who were out there in product development had no cultural depth. They
have no. They don't understand the value of inspiration. And inspiration comes from cultural exposure.
And experience, the cultural experience. And, you know.
I mean, ideas come from doing things like that.
Look what's happening. Look what's happening now in California. My God, from an oasis, a cultural oasis, it's now one of the most exciting places. And yet, when the Broadway used to entertain people who came out to see their stores, they wouldn't take them to the museums. They wouldn't take them to the Chandler Arts Center, which is where you really began to understand how Los Angeles was changing. They didn't. They didn't say to their people, our whole society is changing here. We ought to all take Spanish lessons because we better speak our customers' language. They didn't do it. This was part of our recommendations to them.
I think the other change is lifestyle, you know, because when people became so focused on their bodies and their, you know, and their physical appearance and also just their physical health, that changed the lifestyle. That
was a tremendous.
That was a key change to our business.
And that will go on because the age group that first embraced this was what we call the baby boomer group, and they're going to become even more obsessed with it as they move into their middle years, and they're absolutely terrified of losing that young age.
The other thing is just demographically, I think this enormous change of so many women going back to the workforce has changed our business a lot.
Oh, that's changed.
Because career, you know, there's so much more focus on career apparel. What did career apparel mean 25 years ago? Who cared? Hardly any women were working. I mean, compared to the numbers today. I mean, it didn't make any difference. You had women in our industry or maybe in the retailing industry, but you didn't have that many women in banks and in, you know, Wall Street and,
dressing,
you know.
5 days, 7 days a week.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So I think that...
Well, that was a revolution, and that is a revolution, and I don't even think we've caught up with it. The banks changed their hours, and the stores began to realize...
You know what you're just saying? You're saying something so important just now. I got to go back to it, because it's this thing about inspiration coming from culture. You look at someone as developed in his exposure as a Karl Lagerfeld. Now, if Karl Lagerfeld can go and be interviewed by Winterthur and be inspired by Winterthur.
Well, didn't you find that fascinating?
Fascinating.
Oh, but
that's what these young people don't know. I mean, that's what they don't do. They don't go to museums and they don't go to...
He's having trouble keeping up with that first hurrah.
Well, you'd have to. You know, you couldn't possibly.
And it was just too much.
But like it or not, he had an inspiration. I mean, Provençal was the inspiration for the first, and you know, and whatever. At least there's a point of view. I think that's the biggest problem there. In order to develop a point of view, you have to have an inspiration. And if a Karl Lagerfeld, with all his experience and all his exposure, is not too big a person to get on a plane, go from Paris to London, and to say it, I was inspired by Winterthal, the clothes of the women that were in his paintings, and the. See, that's another part of John that is such a sensitive, beautiful part that I just love. John is a lover of music, of opera. You can turn on the radio and there'll be an opera or symphony on it. You can ask John who wrote it, what movement it is, and John can tell it to you.
Well, yeah, you see, you almost missed telling me that.
And that's a side of him that no one knows. That's a wonderful side. He's taught me things in music. He's, you know, my father always loved opera, so I liked opera. But John has this old record collection that he never played them. He says, "Oh, you can't play them." I said, "Why can't you play them?" He said, "Of course you can play them." So I'm always busy playing the old collection. And the other side of John, I will swear to you, and this is a true story, John has a tremendously wonderful eye for art. Wonderful. He'll look at something and he knows it's great. And, he may not, he could maybe just appreciate it. He maybe can't afford it, or maybe, whatever. But we were in Richard Feigen's gallery about 10 months ago, and maybe even 11 months ago. And Richard had the most beautiful Winterthaler portrait of a woman hanging in his gallery. This was long before Lacroix, that he was influenced by him. It was before the exhibit in London. Nothing was out yet. And John turned to me and he said, "That is the greatest painting. We should buy that. We should own that." He said, "I wish I could afford that." This is a true story. No sooner were the words out of his mouth. A few months later, out comes, they're having this exhibit in London, and Lacroix is influenced by Winterthal, etc., etc., etc. But he has a tremendously sensitive side to him, artistically sensitive side, being this love of music and this, and this tremendous sensitivity for art,
And
not
are
for
we missing
collecting.
something in, I thought from the beginning that there would be merit, that this is an evening honoring him and recording the difference in the man, as well as the fact that he is the man that makes the difference, both. That the fact that he was someone who angeled the theater, musical theater, that he is now supporting you in your involvement with Carnegie Hall.
I want to tell you
missing
something.
and not having some sound
I don't know
there.
whether the theater is where he'd like to put it, but I'll tell you that when we went to this meeting at Carnegie Hall, long before I went on the board there, but this first meeting where they asked us to do that thing. Yeah.
Right.
We were at this meeting, and they asked us to do this thing. And John and I, long ago, made an agreement together that in our charitable endeavors, well, from the point that we started giving charity from our pockets, not from a company or anything, which has been a good 5 years, that any donations that we make come from us, not from the corporation. Unless it's a corporate donation of something, but there's very little of it because it's a public company with a lot of partners, and some of them don't feel the way we do about charity, and they don't want to give the money away. It's a business, and that's all they care about. That's how they feel. They're entitled to feel how they feel. So, but the one, like at Carnegie Hall, we went for this meeting, and essentially what they were doing was asking us to underwrite that evening. And he said to them, "Look, I don't know whether I'm going to underwrite the evening or not." He said, "But I don't think, Laura and I feel that we should have done more for Carnegie Hall." And he said, "Whether we do the evening or not, I'm giving you this much money." And that's John. Now, that night was it was an incredible evening from the standpoint of the artistic, of what Luciano, the value of what he did that night.
I want you
On the
to
other
think
hand,
about what I'm talking about.
I like what you said before, the difference in the man and the man makes a difference.
Well, that's really what it should be.
I mean, people don't know that sensitive side of John.
Well, but that's what I will certainly want to record and will. But what I'm talking about is if we get Revlon, and I've already made I've had my first meeting there, and they're very much
Do you want me to
interested in
call
what I'm
Ronald Perlman?
doing. Not yet,
Okay.
because I've already got something underway.
Because we
And we'll see
happened
how-
to bump into him at the antique show, and I almost said something that I decided not to.
No,
But I was like,
we're something is underway, and when If I think I need that extra nudge, I'm going to do it.
Okay.
Otherwise, let Levine be the one who's piloting it, and I'm working through him. And they're very excited about the concept of identifying their incredible women with the critical eye of these other women who have made choices of clothes.
We asked Gayford if she would donate a
What did you
dress.
say?
Yes.
So,
So
if that happens, there may be a chance to get Liza Minnelli, which would be very wonderful and would be a surprise because she's one of Revlon's incredible women.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm telling you that, and that's very, as I say, very much of an iffy, and it's there, and I'm working toward it if it should happen.
if it should happen, if she should want to sing something from the rink, to produce the rink,
Okay. So then we know that too. Okay. But
that was his
I
plan.
felt, I'm at this point playing lots of levels, and I want you to also keep in mind what you just got through telling me about John and his love for classical music. And if it should be appropriate, it wouldn't even have to be a superstar. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
If there was some incredible young person,
Would that audience understand it?
they might not, but I never underestimate. And if it's done appropriately and right, it could be terrific. So just have it in mind.
Let me tell you what I can do, and I can do that now. I can speak with either Isaac Stern and Jim Wilkinson. I mean, they're my people in this court. I mean, I love them and they love me. And if I said to them, look, John's being honored, we need to have someone wonderful because we're trying to show aspects of John, and one aspect is his love of classical music and his support and our support. You see, he's not really involved in Carnegie Hall.
You
I'm
are.
involved. So
Right.
that's part of the little bit of a problem there. But we can fudge
Right,
over that. But
just leave it aside. I want you
they
to...
will get me someone.
All right, so that...
But I have to give them notice. I mean, even
Right.
if I asked Isaac if he would do it, which he might.
He might. Well,
If he was in New York on June 15th, that's when he's in his schedule a little bit, his summer schedule, so I don't know.
I want you to have it in mind only because of what you tell me just now. And I believe that things should evolve naturally, to be appropriate, and underscore the person. I said this right from the beginning.
Wouldn't it be great if we did Kira Takano or someone?
Have it in mind. Let's see how I do on the Revlon thing. Because we don't want too many things. But we want whatever we have to be absolutely a jewel. Okay?
The only other thing that maybe could happen if Liza said yes, she loves Cheetah. Cheetah
And she.
together
And that
would be
that would be-
incredible. And Jerry Herman loves Johnny. And Jerry would be the person that we could
could offer
call
that.
and say, would you do
All
this?
right. So let's make a notation of that. All right?
So you got Cheetah
hold
and you
that.
got Jerry Herman.
Hold that.
And,
So let's
and-
see where we go.
and Jerry Herman was Jerry's Girls, which Johnny produced. And Cheetah was in Jerry's Girls and The Rink. And Liza was in The Rink.
All right. So let's see where we go with Revlon.
And Liza looks at Cheetah almost like a mother. There's a very strong relationship there.
Thank you for today.
Thank you.